What's up? The topic today is the N+1 database query problem. What exactly is it, and how can we avoid it in our Rails applications? Well, to demonstrate what the N+1 database query problem is, I created a quick Rails application. This Rails application simply has a list of all of the rosters in the NFL. It has two models, a team and a player. A player belongs to a team, and a team has many players. So I want to create a query real quick that just lists out all of the quarterbacks in the NFL. So if we go into my code, I could create this query by making an instance variable players that is player.where position goes to QB. Now if I go to my view, I can simply iterate through this array of players as player, and each time I can print the player.team, player.number, position, the player's name, and the college that that player attended. If I refresh the page here, it looks like the query worked, and I have a list of all of the NFL quarterbacks. But there's a major problem with the code that I wrote. And if we look at my server log and look at the actual query that I wrote, we can see what that problem is. First off, it's absolutely massive. In fact, there's 83 separate SQL queries being run from that one line of code. So this is what's known as the N+1 database query problem. And let's look at what is going on here and what's causing all of these queries to be written. So now let's take a look at our controller. And we see that we're calling the .where method on the player model. This produces the SQL that you would expect. You select the players from the players table where the position is equal to QB and pass that into an active record relation. Now let's take a look at our view. In our view, we're taking this relation and we're iterating through it. And each iteration we're calling for the team, number, position, player, and college. Can you spot the problem here? Well, if you didn't see it, it's that this right here is giving us an issue. Calling for the .team method on the player is not actually asking for an attribute on the player. It's in fact asking for an active record relation because a player belongs to a team. So each iteration that we make through this active record relation, we're calling for the player.team, which needs to separately call the database and find out what team that's referring to. So players.each gets passed in. Each player, first player comes through. Player.team, gotta select what team that is. Next player.team comes in, need to select what that is too. And so on and so forth for each iteration that we make. This is known as the N+1 database query problem because we're querying the database once to get an array of players, then we're iterating through them, and in each iteration we're making a call for an active record relation. We're making a call for a team, and that's going to call the database each time. Wouldn't it be great if we could just call the database once to preload all of these teams, and then we can access them through Ruby code instead of having to make SQL database calls every time? And of course, Rails provides us a great way to do this. But before we go into exactly how you solve it, let's talk real quickly about SQL. This .where method is a Rails method that that writes SQL for you. It'll convert your Ruby code, because this is a Ruby hash right here, and it'll convert your Ruby code into SQL, but you can, if you want, just write pure SQL in it. We could write where position equals QB using the SQL syntax, and that will give us the exact same query. We'll see that it still works, nothing changes, and we have the same query where we're selecting the players where the position is equal to QB. Now the operator that we used here is equals, which checks, of course, if this field is equal to this value. But in SQL, we can use instead the in operator, in, to check if the value is equal to an object or included in an object that we pass in. So in Rails, you want to use this question mark syntax and then replace the question mark with whatever's after the comma, because this will escape your SQL for you and it will help against SQL injection. So instead of saying position equals QB, we can write the exact same thing just like this, where position in question mark gets replaced with QB. And this is saying, is position included in the object that we passed in, QB? And the answer will only be yes for QBs. So let's check out what that does. And we'll see it produces the exact same list and produces the the exact same query, only instead of saying position equals, it says position in, but it does the exact same thing. Now, the reason this syntax is good is instead of passing in just a string, let's pass in an array. Let's say where the position is in QB, or a running back, or a kicker. Any of these positions will match and return them in our query. So let's see how this does. And we'll see that it works. We get running backs, quarterbacks, and kickers now in our list. And let's look at our query. This first query just is a where position in QB, running back, kicker. So this is just, I like to think of in as included. So it's just saying position is included in this object we passed in of quarterback, running back, kicker. Now, of course, we still have this N+1 query where we're hitting the database way too many times, and now, in fact, it's even worse because our players array is larger and we're still calling the database through each iteration. But you can see now kind of how we'd go about solving this. If we have this in syntax, we could try and pass in all of the teams to this in syntax. So we could say where teams in, and then pass in all the teams, and then execute this query on one line. And of course, Rails is going to provide us with a really great way to do that. So let's go back to the original query that we had, where position goes to QB. And let's add a Ruby on Rails method called includes. Let's say players.includes team dot where position goes to QB. And then let's rerun the query and see what happens. So we get our list of all the QBs, just like we would expect, but let's look at the SQL statement that was written. And isn't this a lot nicer? Instead of running 83 separate database calls, it does what's called an eager load of all of the teams. It will look through the code here, what the player is going to be. So we're saying we want all the players where the position is equal to QB, and include all of their teams. Find out what all of their teams are, and go ahead and eager load them with one SQL query, with one database call. So it selects the players where the position is equal to QB, then it eager loads all of the teams. So it'll find out which teams are included in that database call right here, and then it's going to go ahead and load them all in one statement. And now when we iterate through them, instead of having to hit the database with each iteration, this is already loaded up. It's already loaded from the database, and we're just calling it through Ruby code. We're not hitting the database 100 times. We're just hitting it once. And that is so much more efficient. And you can look at these little benchmarks down here, and you can see that it's going to execute a lot quicker. And I mean, it's kind of negligible right now, but as you scale an application, it could become catastrophic if you're not, efficiently querying your database. So let's take another look at this controller right now. And you see that we are including the team relation. We want to eager load that up because we're going to iterate it through it later. And that works pretty well. But now let's use another use case. Instead of listing all the NFL quarterbacks, what if I want to list only the quarterbacks in the NFC? So let's take a look at my view. Instead of NFL quarterbacks, I only want to list the quarterbacks in the NFC conference. Now this might be a little confusing because the conference is a attribute on the team table. I can't just write .where conference goes to NFC because the player table has no field called conference. That field is only included on the team model. So this might be a little bit tricky. How can we efficiently write a query for this? So, your first thought might be, I'm going to run this query to get all of the players where the position is equal to QB. Then I'm going to iterate it through it with Ruby. I'm going to try and map it to an array as x, where x if x.team.conference equals nfc.compact to get rid of the nil values rather. And let's go to Chrome and run this query. And that works. I mean, that's how I would have solved this, a couple weeks ago, is I would have just mapped it to an array. That's great. I get my only NFC QBs. and I look at my statement, I'm eager loading the teams, and that's great. But there is a problem here, and I don't know whether or not you see it, so take a second and see if you see what the problem is. Alright, well, if you didn't get it, the problem is that we're still we're running this SQL query, and we're selecting all of the players where their position is QB, and we're including all their teams. Then we're iterating through that and only getting the teams, we're only passing the teams in the NFC to the view. But we're still iterating through all of the players, and that means we needed to hit the database and include all of the teams, even if they were in the AFC conference. Now you see in the teams that are included in this eager load, there's all 32 teams. What if we only wanted the NFC teams to even be loaded? We only wanted to load the NFC teams. So instead of having to load them all and then Ruby using a .map method to filter it out into the NFC, we want to filter it out in our SQL query. We want to write an SQL query that filters it out, so we make an even better database call than this. And there's a pretty easy way to do that in Ruby, and it's kind of intuitive just once you learn how to do it. And you can filter using a .where statement on a relation, not even on the model that you're querying. So I can say where on the teams table and pass it a hash of where conference goes to NFC. So I'm saying include the teams, but only where the teams has a conference of NFC. So this is all kind of one thing. I'm saying like include the teams if their conference is NFC. And then, of course, the player where their position is QB. This like second level filter here is on the relation that I'm including. And the reason why this is going to be better, as you can see here, is it's going to give us the same result of all the NFL QBs, but it's going to run this in one SQL statement. And it's going to do it using a left outer join, which is a SQL syntax. And it's only going to perform the left outer join on teams.conference equals NFC. So only where the teams.conference equals NFC, you're not even going to need to load the AFC teams at all. So that's an even better way to run that database query. We're doing it all in SQL. We don't need to iterate through it with Ruby. And then this call that we have in our view is only hitting the database once. So we have gone from hitting the database 83 times and taking almost 6 or 7 seconds with our query to hitting the database once, filtering it on a relation, and running it in almost a quarter of the time. So that's the N+1 query problem in Rails. And using this .include syntax, where you can include the relation that you want and eager load it in, is going to save you massive amounts of database hits as you scale your application. So it's important to try and get a good underlying value of what the N+1 database query problem is and how to avoid it. So I hope that helped you guys out, and just remember to always be coding. See you later.